Much the most important news over the last 24 hours is the news that the Israeli Air Force, and it could only have been the Israeli Air Force, carried out a missile strike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, killing a number of Iranian officials and also killing two Iranian generals, one of whom appears to have been the commander of the Al-Quds Force. This is a special forces unit of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. Anyway, this general was the commander of the Al-Quds Force in Syria and Lebanon. Now, there's a number of things that can be said about this attack, the first of which is that this was a straightforward assassination, an extrajudicial killing, a murder, if you like, of two senior officials, in fact, more than just two, but the senior officials of another government. Now, some countries do conduct assassinations of their political opponents. It is, to my knowledge, extremely rare indeed and considered highly controversial when a government carries out assassinations of the top officials of another government. In the case of Israel, it shows no hesitation in doing this and has done this on other occasions also, though perhaps not quite as publicly as on this occasion. The second point is that the building that was attacked was the Iranian consulate, in other words, a diplomatic building, a building with the protections provided by the Vienna Convention. Now, again, attacks on diplomatic buildings are generally looked upon with extreme disfavor around the world. I remember back in 1999, the United States launched a missile strike against a building in Belgrade, which turned out to be the Chinese embassy. There was huge outrage about this in China and many, many protests. The United States expressed regret, though they never quite apologized. And there's been debate and controversy ever since about whether the attack was intentional or not. In China, by the way, the incident is still remembered, and I see quite regularly that it comes up for discussion in the Chinese media. There have been other attacks as well on embassies. I remember that embassies in Beijing themselves came under attack, or at least some form of attack, during the period of the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. But that, of course, was a time of extraordinary political chaos and tension within China. And, of course, in Iran itself, in 1979, Iranian students, or at least that's what they claim to be, invaded and occupied the American embassy, and this caused a massive political crisis between the United States and Iran, which, in my opinion, has never, properly speaking, healed to this day. Now, what I find most remarkable about this attack, this Iranian attack on this consular building in Damascus, is that reading today the newspapers in Britain and the United States, I find scarcely any mention of it. The fact that two top Iranian security officials have been killed, that a consular building protected by the Vienna Convention has been attacked, none of this apparently is especially newsworthy. I have to say, I find this absolutely astonishing. It fills me with disbelief when some years ago the United States government at the time of the presidency of Donald Trump, assassinated the actual head of the Revolutionary Guards Corps, General Soleimani, in Baghdad with a drone. Well, it did attract quite a lot of attention. But this attack, apparently, it's not considered newsworthy or important enough to talk about. Now, I have to say, in the Middle East, obviously in Iran itself, elsewhere around the world, this incident is perceived in an entirely different way. It is seen as another act of lawlessness and violence. And of course, inevitably, people are saying again, why is Israel allowed to do these things? Why are other countries justly penalized when they do them, but Israel not? What sort of system of international law is this rules-based international order that the Western powers constantly talk about if Israel is permitted to do things like this, which of course the rest of the world is not able to do? Well, that is, of course, one take on this matter, and it's entirely, in my opinion, a valid one. But why has Israel taken this astonishing step at this time? I'm going to suggest that it is a sign of growing stress within Israel itself. The operation in Gaza has not gone according to whatever plan existed. I say that I've never really been clear what the Israeli plan in Gaza actually was. There were various announcements made. It was always repeatedly said that Israel would conduct operations in Gaza until Hamas was completely eliminated. That has not happened. Thousands of people in Gaza have been killed. There is a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, but Hamas is still there. Its organization appears to be intact. Maybe large numbers of Hamas fighters have been killed. Probably they have, though not everybody, by the way, necessarily agrees with that view. I'm not going to judge what the realities of that aspect of the campaign are, but the fact is that Israel has suffered huge amount of political damage. And we've now had statements from people in the United States. Chuck Schumer, clearly talking for the Biden administration, has been saying that it's time for Prime Minister Netanyahu to step down and leave office. Donald Trump, the president's opponent, has been coming out and giving interviews to the Israeli media, saying that the entire Israeli military operation in Gaza has been misconceived and has gone wrong and was a mistake, and that Israel needs to rethink its strategy. There's been complaints about Israeli conduct from, of course, many other countries, but over and above and beyond all that, there was that recent vote in the Security Council, which passed a ceasefire resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, leading to a long, sustained ceasefire. There were a few remaining ambiguities squirreled into the resolution to avoid an American veto, but the resolution passed in much stronger terms than I think that the Israeli government itself perhaps anticipated. And beyond that, whilst the United States government abstained on the voting for the resolution, all the European governments supported it, the ones that were represented in the Security Council, and of course Britain and France both veto-wielding permanent members of the Security Council, they both voted for the resolution. So the Israeli government might feel that it is under some sort of pressure. It feels that it is under pressure from the UN bureaucracy. It feels that resolutions are now starting to pass the Security Council, which are not in Israel's favor. It is also the subject of ever-increasing litigation in the International Court of Justice, whose recent prohibitory orders, or rather directions, Israel has chosen to disregard, with Ireland now joining South Africa's claim at the level of in the International Court of Justice. All of this is going on, and perhaps it's not surprising that Israel, the Netanyahu government, feels that it is under some sort of pressure. And I think it has taken this step principally in order to communicate both to the Israeli people and to its own supporters in the United States, who remain numerous and strong, and who undoubtedly include the president himself, that Israeli resolve is undiminished, that the Israelis remain as tough and as determined as ever, and that they will see this operation in Gaza through. They will not submit to American pressure not to conduct the offensive that they're now talking about in Rafah, the one remaining town in the Gaza Strip that they have not so far attacked. Israel will press on and do that. And as for resolutions by the Security Council, as for international laws and conventions, protections for diplomatic personnel, proceedings in the International Court of Justice, Israel will ignore all of those. It considers itself somehow immune from this kind of legal action. It has convinced itself, or at least it regularly claims, that all of these institutions are structurally biased against itself. It's taking an attitude, in other words, of defiance against global opinion, and that it wants to make it clear that however strong the opposition to Israel is, whatever limits international law might place, Israel will simply do whatever it considers necessary in order, as it would claim, to ensure its existence and the safety of its people. Well, I have to say, I think this is a desperate and a reckless step. It's been suggested that another plan is to try to provoke the Iranians into some sort of massive overreaction, perhaps Iranian missile strikes in retaliation against Israeli territory, that Prime Minister Netanyahu, with the war in Gaza not going especially well, with the Israeli economy contracting, with apparently a number of people actually leaving Israel, the number of people leaving Israel actually increasing, it may be that Prime Minister Netanyahu is calculating that the moment has come for him to escalate the crisis even further, widen the war, involve Iran, drag in the United States, and this is the best way that he can both ensure his own position within Israel and re-establish Israel's position in Gaza and on the Palestinian territories and in the wider Middle East. I'm going to say that I think that this is a misreading of the situation. Yes, Israel does have still an astonishing level of protection when it carries out actions of this kind. Witness again the virtually non-existent media response. Just saying. But overall, the facts point in the opposite direction. We've seen that the United States has not been able to assert its authority in the Middle East over the last few months. The bombing war in Iraq and Syria appears to have achieved nothing. The bombing war against the Houthis in Yemen has achieved nothing. They're still able to interdict shipping. They now have the comfort, if that's the right word, of the presence of both Chinese and Russian warships in the Middle East. There's a Russian naval flotilla in the Red Sea. Even as I make this program, I was reading only yesterday that ships from this flotilla have now docked at the Eritrean port of Massawa, and they've been apparently well received there. The relationship between Eritrea and Russia, and Eritrea and Ethiopia, and Russia and Ethiopia is getting ever closer. And of course, the Russians have good relations with Saudi Arabia too. And of course, the Chinese, far more powerful naval power than the Russians, are there also. And their relations with both Ethiopia and Saudi Arabia, both now BRIC states, by the way, are now excellent. So the trend in the region is not in Israel's favor, to put it mildly. The trend in European public opinion is not in Israel's favor either. The British government, for example, and the German government have wanted to side with Israel in this crisis. They're finding it increasingly difficult to maintain that stance. Even Annalena Baerbock has recently been making rather muted criticisms of Israel, just saying. And of course, in the United States itself, the strains are increasing. The president remains committed to Israel. He still wants to supply Israel with weapons. He supplied Israel with ammunition. He apparently wants to supply Israel with more F-15 fighter jets and more bombers and all of those sort of things. But of course, he is under pressure from within his own Democratic Party. He's under pressure from parts of his electorate. And of course, his administration is having to worry about the deteriorating situation in the Middle East. Also, I have to say that I think that if this attack was intended to provoke the Iranians, then it has probably misjudged the Iranians badly. I think that the Iranians, furious though they will no doubt be because of this attack on their consulate, furious as they will be because of this attack on their generals, will nonetheless calibrate their response carefully. They understand that if they start active hostilities against Israel, they will be walking into a trap. They do not want to be in an open-ended conflict with Israel that will involve the United States. That has been their stance ever since the events of 7th of October. On the Duran, that is what we said the Iranian response to the events of 7th October would be. And I don't think that this attack, infuriating for the Iranians, as of course it is, will lead them to change their policies. They will strike back, but they will strike back in a way and at a time of their choosing, and they have shown that they have both the ruthlessness and the capability to do it. So, I think, a miscalculation by a administration, a government in Israel that is sensing that for the first time since the 1973 war, the situation is now spiraling out of its own control. That doesn't make this act any the less wrong, nor does it make this act any the less dangerous. Of course, if the Iranians do not exercise the levels of restraint, or perhaps I should say the levels of self-discipline that I expect them to, then the situation might conceivably escalate much further, in which case we might end up with that all-out war in the Middle East that diplomacy up to now has striven so successfully to prevent. And I cannot see how that can end in any way that would benefit Israel. Just saying. But anyway, reckless, dangerous, wrong it might be. Israel has done it. I think that Iranian self-discipline will hold. I think the Israelis will claim some kind of hollow victory. It won't, of course, affect Iranian influence in Syria or in Lebanon or with Hezbollah. And whatever hollow victory Israel might claim, in the end, I think this will not work out to its advantage. I'm going to finish by making one observation. One of the striking facts about this crisis, the crisis going all the way back to the events of the 7th of October, is the now total collapse in Israeli-Russian relations. Now, it's not been widely spoken about, but over the long period of Putin's rule, Russian Israeli relations have been relatively close. They've never been allies. They've never been exactly friends. But Putin and Netanyahu got on reasonably well together. I remember that some years ago, Netanyahu was even invited to attend the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow on Red Square and was there sitting next to Putin on the podium in Red Square as those celebrations were taking place. And I always got the sense that Netanyahu himself understood the value of that relationship. He understood that the Russians were there to help him if he needed them in dealing with the Syrians and in dealing with the Iranians, and that having this relationship with the Russians works to Israel's net advantage. I think the Russians, for their part, also, by the way, were anxious to maintain some kind of relationship with Israel also, because they saw it as a means to keep the Middle East, the situation in the Middle East, stable. What has now happened is that the Russians now consider that Israeli actions, far from keeping the situation in the Middle East stable, are on the contrary, causing instability and the danger of war there, and their relationship with Israel has therefore massively cooled. And I think that Netanyahu, who, as I said, historically valued his relationship with the Russians, which also appealed to the large Russian-Israeli community within Israel itself, Netanyahu now finds that the course of actions that he has taken since 7th October has lost Israel and himself that connection to Russia, which he previously had. With the result that Russia, from having been a friendly partner, is now increasingly looking again like an adversary. Perhaps he's not too bothered, but I would say, if so, he is wrong. It is a sign of the extent to which Israel is gradually losing friends and is gradually drifting into a situation of isolation, which this latest act will accelerate. Anyway, this is all I'm going to say about this event today. We're going to see more, no doubt, coming out of the Middle East within the next few days and hours. All eyes will now be on Tehran. The phone lines between Tehran, Moscow, Beijing, and by the way, I suspect Riyadh and Ankara will no doubt be hot, and a lot of people will want to have their say and will be urging the Iranians at this time to exercise restraint. And I suspect, as I said, that they will do so, that they have the intelligence and the self-discipline to understand that acting now precipitously is not in their own interests or that of the general situation in the Middle East, which does not, of course, mean that they will not react at some point and in some way of their own choosing. Anyway, with that, I'm now going to return to the events in Ukraine, because we've had a lot of information now starting to come out from the battlefronts. Now, last night was the first night in several, I think it's been about a period of about a week now, when we did not have news of a major missile strike by the Russians across Ukraine. The Russians clearly have ticked off the boxes on the various list of targets that they had put together, and the result is that the focus has now shifted back towards the ground operations. But we have been getting news about the effect of this missile strike, of these missile strikes, these successive days of missile strikes on one specific location in Ukraine, and that is the city of Kharkiv. Now, I said a few days ago that I understood that after several days of blackout, some degree of electric power had been returned to Kharkiv. It seems that this is very, very patchy, and both the mayor and governor, the mayor of Kharkiv and the governor of Kharkiv region, have now come out and said straightforwardly that the city now has no power systems. It's the power generation factories, the power plants around Kharkiv have been put permanently out of action. It would require a return to peaceful conditions for them to be reconstructed, and that would be a task that would need months, perhaps even years, for a complete restoration of power supplies to Kharkiv to take place. So that means that factories in Kharkiv can no longer work. Kharkiv, of course, used to be one of Ukraine's major industrial centers. The Malyshev tank factory is located there. This is the factory which, during the period of the Soviet Union, developed the T-34 and T-64 tanks, just saying. Anyway, that tank factory is now permanently out of production. So are various other big industrial plants and factories located in and around Kharkiv. Businesses can no longer operate to any significant degree within Kharkiv. And, well, one way or the other, the overall story now is that the city has been reduced to a husk. Indeed, I think it was the governor of the city actually came forward, the governor of the region actually came forward and said that Kharkiv, as of this moment in time, is no longer an economic or an industrial center. Now, bear in mind, we are talking about what used to be, until a few days ago, a week or so ago, Ukraine's second biggest city. It's a major part, it used to contribute a major part to Ukraine's economy. In fact, I remember that back in 2014, there were claims, I don't know to what extent these were true, but there used to be claims that Kharkiv, at that time, this is at the time of the Maidan uprising and coup d'etat or revolution, call it whatever you wish, at that time, that Kharkiv was actually Ukraine's richest city. So the fact that Kharkiv has essentially been switched off, that is a significant, a major blow to Ukraine's overall economy. Now, I've seen many people deny this. I've seen many people say that this isn't, that Ukraine can continue to function without Kharkiv, which of course it can. But of course, it is now a severely diminished Ukraine. And I think people underestimate the extent to which this reduction, economically and socially speaking, of Ukraine, they underestimate how big that has been. On top of that, it's clear that the population, or at least a large part of it, has made the entirely understandable decision to leave the town. And there's been film published, which I've seen, of one of the motorways leading from Kharkiv towards the west, and all 4 lanes of the motorway, both the ones leading to Kharkiv and the ones leading from Kharkiv, are now jammed with traffic of people leaving Kharkiv with their belongings. It is actually a deeply distressing picture when you see it. And, well, what does it mean? What does it mean in terms of military significance? Does it mean that there is going to be a Russian attack on Kharkiv? That the Russians are now planning to capture Kharkiv? Or, having reduced it to a husk, will the Russians be satisfied and leave it at that? Well, Kharkiv, I've never been to it, but I've had it described. People like Gonzalo Lira, my late friend, who of course perished there in a Ukrainian prison. Anyway, I remember him talking to me about the vast, sprawling size of Kharkiv, the fact that this is a huge city in terms of its area and the way that it's been built up. And of course, as is often the case with Soviet-type cities, it is made up of large, big residential apartment blocks and also, obviously, factories. I spoke about the Malishev factory, and also very, very large and impressive public buildings. Indeed, I seem to remember that one of the iconic Soviet-era apartment buildings from the 1930s. Huge building. I think at the time it was built, the largest apartment building in Europe is located in Kharkiv. So if the Ukrainians were to decide to defend Kharkiv, it would probably be a difficult place to capture. Having said that, the Russians have captured big places before. They captured Mariupol, which is significantly smaller than Kharkiv. It's about, as I understand it, an eighth of the size. Kharkiv had a population, I believe, of 2 million people. Mariupol had a population of 270,000 people. That gives you a sense of the difference. But nonetheless, the Russians were able to take Mariupol, and they were able to work through it actually very fast over a period of some weeks. And of course, the Russians today arguably are in a better position to carry out rapid captures of populated areas. They have far more drones and specialized drones than they did when they captured Mariupol in 2022. They have far more experience of urban fighting. They gained that in Mariupol and Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and in Bakhmut. And of course, they showed also how it could be done in Avdiivka recently. Obviously, this Avdiivka is a small place, but anyway, they have now the experience of fighting in urban locations. They can deploy their air force very effectively in Kharkiv, because with the population emptying, with leaving, and with the city emptying, they're in a position to bomb Kharkiv with these massive Fab bombs that they have, soon to be joined by the Fab 3000s, and we can see what enormous devastation these bombs can do. Bear in mind that a Russian offensive against Kharkiv would presumably take place from Belgorod, which is, I believe, about 60, 70 kilometers away, maybe a bit longer. I'm not exactly sure, but there are large airfields in and around Belgorod, which could, from which aircraft bombing Kharkiv could operate, and that would mean that the Russians could bomb Kharkiv on a round-the-clock basis, inflicting colossal devastation on any Ukrainian troops that sought to defend it. And as Dima at the Military Summary channel absolutely correctly pointed out, we see how already the Russians have been bombing Kharkiv. Already the Russians have been sending aircraft overflying Kharkiv. And the striking thing is that the Ukrainian military, are unable to respond. The air defense systems around Kharkiv have been completely destroyed. And on that topic, by the way, I noticed that the latest briefing by the Russian Defense Ministry refers to more S-300 air defense systems having been destroyed over the last 24 hours. And I wonder whether these were the ones in Kharkiv. So, yes, it would be a difficult place to capture. It would require a large commitment of resources from the Russians to capture it. But that's not to say it can't be done. And perhaps it is what the Russians intend to do. If the Russians capture Kharkiv, it will be a devastating psychological blow for Ukraine. And by the way, it would open the way for a further Russian advance towards another big town, big city west of Kharkiv, which is Poltava, another Russian-speaking city, by the way, in eastern Ukraine, famous in Russian history as the location of a victory that Peter the Great won against the Swedes back in the 18th century. But anyway, the important point now is that the fall of Kharkiv, I think, would probably make Ukrainian defenses in Poltava undefendable also. Well, whether the Russians will do it or not, I don't know. We'll just have to see. Probably we will get a decision over the next few days or weeks. Perhaps we will see what step the Russians take sometime in May when the Rasputitsa ends. Anyway, that's the situation in Kharkiv. It's important, by the way, not to overlook again the humanitarian crisis. There's been no negotiations. I've discussed this many times. There was a draft agreement almost hammered out by the Russians and the Ukrainians back in 2022, almost exactly 2 years ago now, and that wasn't executed upon. This tragedy in Kharkiv, and it is a terrible tragedy, is taking place as a result of a war which should never have happened, and of which there have been plenty of opportunities, in my opinion, to bring to an end. But there it is. Now, all this focus on Kharkiv, perhaps drawing attention away from the other places where all sorts of important things are happening. And to repeat again, the major focus of Russian military operations is central Donbas, the area from Marinka in the south up to Siversk in the north, but with the particular emphasis at the moment on the areas to the west of Avdiivka and to the west of Bakhmut. Bakhmut being the town that the Russians, the heavily fortified town, which the Russians captured in May 2023, or to be more precise, which the Wagner organization captured for the Russians in May 2023, and Avdiivka being the other heavily fortified town, which the Russians captured as recently as February. Now, as I've discussed in many programs, there have been intense fighting west of Avdiivka. The Ukrainians first tried to form a defense line around the village of Lastochkino, west of Avdiivka. The Russians captured that fairly quickly. The Ukrainians then tried to make a further stand along a line of villages, Tonenka, Orlovka, and Berdichi. And between Orlovka and Berdichi, there's also this village of Semyonovka, which I think we should also actually, probably speaking, include in this line. Tonenka and Orlovka fell about 2 weeks ago. There is the Russians, it is now definitely confirmed, by the way, have entered Semyonovka. There are even suggestions that Semyonovka might be about to fall, but actually there's very little information coming out from that village. But there's no doubt that the Russians are there. There's apparently film which confirms the fact. But anyway, there's intense fighting going on in Semyonovka. The Russians also fighting the Ukrainians in South Berdichi. The Russian Defense Ministry confirms that a 6th Abrams tank was destroyed. Not, I think, exactly in Berdichi, but nearby to Berdichi. So there's fighting along the two northernmost villages of this defence line, but the southern part of this defence line, the part near the part involving Orlovka and Tonenka, has collapsed. And I've discussed how the Russians have been advancing westwards from Tonenka specifically, and to some extent, by the way, as is now clear, from Orlovka as well, advancing across the fields. I discussed yesterday how there had been a massive Russian armoured fist launched from Tonenka with 36 tanks and 12 infantry fighting vehicles. The Ukrainians, by the way, claimed that they'd repelled this attack. They published film showing some of these armoured vehicles being destroyed with drones and such things. The Ukrainian claims of success against this armoured punch have been repeated without query by newspapers in Britain, such as the Daily Telegraph. The information from the front lines, so far as I can see, is actually telling a completely different story. It seems that the Russians have in fact captured most of the fields, most of the area west of Orlovka and Tonenka. They're now coming close to the other villages, the next line of villages that where the Ukrainians are trying hurriedly to set up a new defense line. I believe this is the area of the famous water barriers that we've been hearing so much about. There's doubts apparently that this defense line is ready, and there are fears or expectations that the Russians will be able to steamroll right through it. Whether that is true or not, I'm not in a position to say, but we will no doubt find out soon. In the meantime, this big advance west of Tonenka and Orlovka, as I have said, has brought all the areas to the north of Pervomaisky under Russian control. And I think it is now acknowledged that that flag, that picture that I was talking about 2 days ago, of the Russian flag being raised over a smashed building in a blasted landscape at the very northeastern end of Pervomaisky, that is actually happened in Pervomaisky itself, which shows that the Russians now control at least the northeastern part of Pervomaisky. The northwestern part of Pervomaisky. It is possible that there are still Ukrainian troops south of this Russian position. There is a reservoir, which one can see in this photo, just west of this place where this Russian flag has been raised. It's possible that the Ukrainians are still holding out there in this area south of the reservoir, in other words, in the southwestern part of Pervomaisky. But with the Russians also holding positions in the central part of Pervomaisky to the east and to the south of Pervomaisky, it really does look to me as if the defense of this town has all but collapsed. So, we've had more information. It's clear that this tank advance, probably part of a more elaborate and wider advance anyway, that this tank advance has been successful. And it seems as if the Russians have occupied actually more territory west of Tonenka and Orlovka than I'd suspected, and that it isn't just this territory in northwest of Pervomaisky that they now control, but also the fields well to the north of this territory as well, with the Russians, as I said, now very close to the towns, the villages rather, that form the new defense line along this river barrier. So it looks like a collapse, with the Russians having advanced so far westward from Orlovka and Tonenka. Ukrainian defenses in Berdychi and Semyonovka really do look like desperate holdouts against an oncoming tide, and it makes the analysis that I read out some days ago from this Russian newspaper, Redovka, which is published in Smolensk, now begins to make rather more sense when, not if, the Ukrainians do finally start pulling back from Berdychi and Semyonovka, with the Russians controlling the ground to the west and the south of these places. The retreat along dirt tracks will have to take place with the Russians positioned all the way to the south. It looks like along the line of the retreat, all along the line of the retreat on the south. It's going to be an extremely difficult retreat indeed, and Ukrainian losses are likely to be extremely high. Redovka seems to me to be right. It does seem as if the Ukrainians overcommitted to this defense of Berdychi, especially. They seem to have allowed themselves to become obsessed with holding Berdychi, which seems bizarre, actually. But anyway, they allowed themselves to become obsessed with Berdychi. Maybe they fear that if the Russians capture Berdychi, they will be able to move further up the railway towards Ocheretino and start to take Ukrainian forces elsewhere in Donbas, to attack them on the flanks. Who knows? But one way or the other, the decision to cling on to Berdychi for as long as they have done is starting to look like a very serious mistake. But anyway, there it is. A major Russian advance in this area. Apparently, the Russian bombing has been, again, extremely intense. And all of this has happened during the time of the Rasputitsa. We see that the Russians are able to continue to advance, including across fields during the Rasputitsa period. Now, Dima at the Military Summary Channel made what I think is a correct point. He said that if you take the battle of Avdiivka as a whole, and we are still in a kind of way discussing an epilogue to that battle, if you take this whole battle from its point of beginning in October, then what you're actually seeing is a gradual acceleration in the pace of the Russian advance. The Russians are beginning to advance more quickly. And Dima, I think, correctly says that part of the reason for this is the absence of strong fortifications west of Avdiivka. something which Ukrainian bloggers like Butuzev have been complaining about for weeks now. The Ukrainians failed to create proper fortified lines west of Avdiivka. And so, as the Russians crash through each hurriedly improvised defense line, the pace of the advance gradually accelerates. And of course, with the ground starting to harden in April, perhaps the pace of the advance will harden still. Now, the one I suspect limiting factor is that, of course, the further and faster the Russians move, the more demanding it will be to keep their forces supplied logistically. If one is looking at the areas to the west of Avdiivka, they're not so well connected to railway lines and roads as places to the north and south, and it may be that over time it will be this more than anything else that gradually slows the Russian advance. In other words, it'll be the difficulty of maintaining logistical support for the advancing formations that is more of a problem than Ukrainian resistance. But certainly it does look as if resistance west of Avdiivka, west of Tonenka and Orlovka, Ukrainian resistance is collapsing. Now, this, of course, connects to the battles that are taking place in other areas. We have heard less news over the last 24 hours from Novomikhailivka and from Georgievka. There has been some news that the Russians have increased the territory that they control in Krasnogorovka. All of these places, Krasnogorovka, Georgievka, and Novomikhailivka, are of course places which are connected to the previous battle of Marinka, which the Russians captured in December. And it's likely that the Russians, in fact, are making progress in all of these places. In fact, the very fact that we're getting less news from them after what appear to have been decisive advances over the previous few days suggests to me that what we're now seeing, especially Novomikhailivka, are mopping up and clearing operations rather than anything else, and that probably explains why we're hearing so little news. It's likely that at some point over the next couple of days, the Russian Defense Ministry will, as I've said, confirm the capture of Novomikhailivka. Georgievka might have somewhat longer to go. The situation will start to become more difficult for the Ukrainian garrison further south in the important fortified town of Vuhledar. The net around Vuhledar is starting to tighten. The Russians are already showing signs of renewed interest in Vuhledar. Apparently they've been bombing and shelling Vuhledar much more intensively over the last few days rather. I suspect that at some point, as the Russians complete the capture of Novomikhailivka, if they haven't already captured Novomikhailivka, capture Georgievka, Konstantinovka, another village to the west, and of course the town of Krasnogorovka, were the Russians able to interfere with the supplies to Vuhledar, and the important town of Kurakovo itself coming under attack. I suspect that we're going to see, at some point, maybe in May, a renewed offensive by the Russians against Vuhledar, but on a much, much more intense scale than anything we have seen at any point in the conflict up to this time. And, well, we'll defer discussing that for when it happens. Now it's the situation in central Donbas, but the southern end of central Donbas. Information from further north is, if possible, even more dramatic. And here I'm talking specifically about the Bakhmut area. And again, and not for the first time, we have seen the Russians advance much further and faster than some of the reports previously had been suggesting. This again, by the way, confirms, as I see it, my earlier point that because we're not getting particular news from a particular location, it doesn't necessarily mean that things aren't happening there. It may mean that the Russian military authorities, and by the way, the Ukrainian military authorities, concerned about the progress of a battle that is of particular importance, that the authorities on both sides are clamping down tightly on information flow. And that's why when we finally discover that the Russians are where we don't expect them to be, it can sometimes come as a bit of a surprise. Now, about a week ago, last week in fact, the Russians captured Ivanivska. And there's a lot of talk and discussion about what the Russians would do, and there was suggestions that the Russians would advance gradually from Ivanivska, that they'd clean up the Ukrainian defenses, the holdouts in Klashevka and Andreevka further to the south. These are two small villages further to the south, before mounting an offensive towards Chasov Yar. And in fact, it has turned out completely otherwise. Throughout this time, we were getting lots and lots of reports. And in fact, there's been reports about this going back to before the new year, that the Russians were conducting a massive bombing and drone campaign against Ukrainian defense positions to the east of Chasiv Yar, in the fields to the east of Chasiv Yar. That they were bombing Ukrainian trench lines and fortified positions and forested areas along these lines. And we were getting lots of reports about this, but no real sign that there was an actual Russian ground operation taking place. Anyway, this ground operation appears to have happened probably last week and early this week. And it seems that the Russians have now captured all of these Ukrainian fortified positions and are now literally outside this eastern part of Chasiv Yar, which lies east of the canal, the Chasiv Yar canal. And the expectation is that once the Russians have consolidated control, once they've established communications, transport links to their forward troops who now occupy this territory, once they've developed proper jamming cover for their troops in these advanced positions. One of the things that the Russians are always, I've noticed, careful to do when they advance is that given that the most effective weapon that the Ukrainians seem to have in slowing down the Russians now are FPV drones, and given that the Russians have shown increasing proficiency in jamming these drones, what the Russians do is that as part of a consolidation of their advance, of any advance in any particular location, they then establish jamming stations to prevent Ukrainian FPV drones from striking at their forward troops. And by the way, they like to assign a group of drone operators to a particular territory where the advance has happened, so that the Russians can then start to launch FPV drone strikes of their own against the Ukrainian defenders that they intend to attack. So I suspect all of this is now going on. The Russians probably working out how to consolidate the logistical lines to their forward positions close to Chasov Yar, bringing up jammers to block the Ukrainian drones. We see pictures of this sometimes. I've seen recently film that the Ukrainians have published of FPV, or at least of attempted FPV drone strikes, and it's notable how grainy sometimes the picture becomes, which is a sign of intense jamming. And on one occasion, just before a drone was supposed to strike a vehicle, the picture went blank completely, which, by the way, makes it far from clear to me that the drone did actually strike the Russian vehicle it was aimed at. But anyway, that's just saying. So the Russians will be doing all of this. That will probably take a while to work out, probably some weeks, and then maybe later this month, remember the ground is still soft, the Russians will then push it to Chasiv Yar itself, at least to this outlying part of Chasiv Yar, east of the canal. And the question then is, if they do capture this part of Chasiv Yar, do they intend to cross the canal and take the rest of Chasiv Yar, or do they intend instead to advance north along the canal in order to support this other offensive that they're currently in the process of preparing to capture the strategic town of Siversk further to the north? There's been a lot of debate about this, and I'm hardly, again, the person to give an expert view. I'm no sort of expert. And of course, as I often say, the Russian High Command doesn't like to share its information, certainly not with me. All I would say is this: my own view on this has changed. It's gone backwards and forwards many times. But it seems to me that with the Russians having now got so close to Chasiv Yar, having put themselves in a position where they can capture this eastern part of Chasiv Yar, it would be rather illogical if they stopped there. The canal is hardly a big barrier. I would have thought that they would want to move on and take the rest of Chasiv Yar, which they have heavily bombed, and which, if they let it remain under Ukrainian control, might potentially be a threat to them in the future. I would have thought that they would want to take Chasiv Yar and gain control of the high ground which supposedly it represents. And I think that must probably be their intention. But anyway, we will have to wait and see. But one way or the other, one way or the other, we can see that the Russians have achieved significant progress, again, in the Bakhmut area, and now seem to be poised to make a big advance west of Bakhmut, perhaps taking in Chasov Yar, perhaps gaining control of other locations further north. One way or the other, the situation for the Ukrainians is becoming worse on the battlefronts. And the Ukrainians now face the prospect of a major Russian advance through the center of their lines in the most critical area, with the Russians potentially pushing through to places like, well, Vuhledar in the south, Pokrovsk and Kurahovo, and of course Kramatorsk, and pushing on beyond that to the Dnieper, towards the cities, the key cities of Zaporozhye and Dnipro. And, well, I don't know what the electric power layouts in places like Zaporozhye and Dnipro is, but it seems to me that if the Russians can reduce a city like Kharkiv to a husk, as they have just done, well, presumably they could do the same to Zaporozhye and to Kharkov also. Now, going back to the question of Kharkiv, Zelensky, who has given all kinds of strange interviews, gave a further one, I believe it was to CBS, in which he apparently conceded that if trends continue as they are on the battlefronts, then the likelihood increases that the Russians will be able to capture big Ukrainian cities. And obviously, the most vulnerable at the moment is Kharkiv. If Kharkiv is captured, as I said, it will be a major psychological blow for the Ukrainians. I think at that point, it will be very difficult indeed to persuade the Ukrainian people that the war is not being lost. And of course, if the Russians are able to take Kharkiv, it will also be more difficult to argue that the capture of big cities, places like Zaporozhye, for example, which is mostly on the east bank of the Dnieper, and of course Poltava, is beyond the Russians as well. So it's a high stakes game. We don't quite know exactly what it is that the Russians plan to do. And of course they keep us guessing, and they keep us distracted by operations in all kinds of directions. Now, a couple of days ago, we did a program, a live stream on the Duran, Alex Christoforo and I, and we were privileged to interview Colonel Jacques Beau of the Swiss military, NATO, once assigned to NATO, person with a huge encyclopedic knowledge of Russian military doctrines and theories. He discussed there a concept of what the Russians call operational art, the art of operations, something that lies between tactics and strategy. And the important point is that the Russians refer to it as an art, though perhaps the word искусство, which is translated as art, it also contains within it perhaps something of a meaning of craftsmanship as well, skilled craftsmanship. And we could see that in the way in which the Russians move troops around, keep the Ukrainians guessing. The idea that it's possible to anticipate what the Russians will do because so many satellites and drones keep everything under observation all the time. It's clearly, as I said before, it's clearly at the very least a very simplified and oversimplified picture of the reality. On the contrary, the Russians have shown great skill in keeping the West and Ukraine guessing about what they're going to do. And we see that the Russians do this all the time. So they recently launched offensives towards Rabotino. They gradually recovered most of Bradley Square. The Ukrainians at one time thought that this was where the Russians were going to launch their main assault. Clearly wasn't. A couple of months ago, back in the late summer, early autumn, the Russians were pushing towards Kupiansk. Lots of alarm in Ukraine about what the Russians were going to do there. Large numbers of Ukrainian troops concentrated to hold Kupiansk and to prevent the Russians undoing the success of Ukraine's Kharkov offensive of the autumn of 2022. And then the Russians arrived close to Kupiansk and basically stopped. The Russians playing a similarly complex game along the Zherebets River and the Oskol rivers. They advance, they stop, they retreat, they keep again the Ukrainians guessing. The Ukrainians deploy troops to these places to try to hold the lines, troops that they could be keeping elsewhere. Jacques Beau says that the Americans call this kind of thing shaping operations. I've often heard this expression used, and we could see that. But the major fist so far has been in central Donbas. And I think that, at least for the moment, that is all the signs are, that is where the big blow is going to fall. The Russians clearing the Ukrainian positions there, breaking the remaining Ukrainian fortifications, which are becoming thinner and lighter. The Ukrainians running out of operational space as the Dnieper draws closer. And of course, the Russians keeping everybody tense and wondering about what they might or what they might not do in Kharkiv. Operational art, craftsmanship, skill, command, if you wish, call it whatever you like. But that, I think, is what we're seeing. Well, this is where I end today's program. More from me soon. Obviously, much to discuss about the situation in the Middle East over the next few days. A dangerous situation, but I expect, as I said, that Iranian discipline will hold. As I said, this is where I end today's program. More from me soon. Remind you again, you can find all our programs on our platforms, Locals, Rumble, X. Don't forget, you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star. Links under this video. You can check out our shop, get yourself the things there, the magic mugs, the hats, the reverse gear tops, shirts, all of these great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.